So today's episode comes to you courtesy of Casio, who's been supporting this channel as a general tier patron. I truly couldn't do this without the support from amazing patrons like Casio, so again, Casio, thank you so much. And actually today, Casio's gonna handle the intro for me.
Hi Mitch, this is Casio from Baltimore. For my deck tech, I would like to see a build around Questing Beast, focusing on Death Touch and Fog.
So, Questing Beast is a 4/4 beast with Vigilance, Death Touch, and Haste that costs 2 green. It can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less, and combat damage will be dealt by creatures you control can't be prevented, and on top of that, whenever it deals combat damage to an opponent, it deals that much damage to target planeswalker that player controls. Now, the direction for this commander is a fantastic one because Death Touch and Fog is a very nasty combination with this commander. Again, of course, Questing Beast does have Death Touch, and on top of that, it does say combat damage will be dealt by creatures you control can't be prevented, specifically your creatures. That means if you were to cast a spell like Fog, or any other kind of a Fog effect, you would be preventing combat damage on that turn. But again, thanks to Questing Beast, this could not prevent combat damage for your creatures. Your creatures still dish out that damage, but your opponents do not. And with creatures that have Death Touch like Questing Beast, well, again, it just takes 1 point of damage from them to take out any of your opponent's creatures, so you become incredibly deadly during combat. Whereas your opponents, well, they're not going to know what hit them at first, and then after that, they're going to have no idea what to do during combat because swinging at you is an incredibly deadly proposal, and so is blocking your creatures. So yeah, I really like this direction for this commander. I think it's a very unique and interesting one, and one that can be very effective. And just a quick reminder, outside of the commander, every single card in this deck is less than $1, so it's a very budget-friendly deck. And on this episode, I'm going to break this deck down into different tactics to show you how this deck works and how we're going to win with it. And of course, on top of that, in the description below, there's a link to the deck list, so make sure you check that out. And now with all that said, let's jump into it. First up, there's Wayfarer's Bauble. Yes, that's right, Wayfarer's Bauble is now finally budget again. I think it's around 30 cents or so at this point, so I am, well, just over the moon. Do people still say that? No, probably not. Anyways, Wayfarer's Bauble is an artifact that has pay 2, tap, sacrifice it to your library, basic land card, put that card on battlefield, tap, then shuffle. And of course, in green, we've got plenty of other great ways to ramp with this deck with cards like Cultivate, Kodama's Reach, Grow from the Ashes, Explore, Sakura Triumph Elder, Fond Fertility, Edge of Autumn, Rampant Growth, and Search for Tomorrow. Yeah, we're not lacking in options when it comes to ramping in green. But now let's move on and talk about our Fogs in this deck, starting with, well, Fog and Fog Frog. So yeah, Fog is basically the original card where the term comes from. It's an instant for a green that says prevent all combat damage to be dealt this turn. So for just 1 mana, we can essentially blank a combat, and again with this commander, we're only blanking our opponent's side of things. Since our combat damage from our creatures can't be prevented, our creatures still hit, whereas our opponents do not. And again, with the Death Touch aspect of this commander and some of our creatures, this can be very deadly. So of course, we've also got Spore Frog, which doesn't have Death Touch, but it does have Sacrifice Spore Frog, prevent all combat damage to be dealt this turn. So yeah, there's a reason they call this little card Fog Frog. And of course, we're nowhere near done with our Fogs just yet. We've got Winds of Calcisma, Blast, Respite, and Respite. Wind says prevent all combat damage to be dealt this turn, and if we control a creature with power 4 or greater, instead prevent all combat damage to be dealt this turn by creatures your opponents control. Now that is slightly redundant if our commander's in play, but we'll still take it. And then next up there's Blessed Respite, which says target player shuffles their graveyard into their library, prevent all combat damage to be dealt this turn. So on top of fogging, this can really help us hose a graveyard-centric deck. And then Respite says prevent all combat to be dealt this turn, you gain 1 life for each attacking creature. So on top of fogging, this can gain us some life to pad our life total in the process. Next up, we've got some fogs that can actually be cycled as well with Lull and Hazel Pollen. Lull can be cycled for 2, and Hazel Pollen can be cycled for 3. And then Pause Reflection might cost 3 mana, but it can actually be a free spell for us because it does have Convoke. So with this fog, we can actually tap our creatures to help cast the spell. Moving on, we've got Terrifying Presence, which says prevent all combat damage will be dealt by creatures other than target creature this turn. So this one can actually be utilized in a somewhat sneaky way by, if our opponents are actually attacking each other and we make a deal with one opponent to allow one of their creatures to deal combat damage and others not to. And then Root Snare is just a standard fog, but Blinding Fog says prevent all damage that be dealt to creatures this turn. Creatures you control gain hexproof until end of turn. So this one can actually protect our creatures in multiple ways. Again, giving them hexproof can be a great way to protect them from targeted removal. But now that we've talked about our fogs, let's move on and talk about the other aspect of this deck. And that would be Death Touch creatures, and of course we've got a ton of them, starting off with some very low to the ground ones like Moss Viper, Tedru, Blightblade, and Sedge Scorpion. Each of these are just 1/1s for a green, but again they do have Death Touch, which in this deck makes them incredibly deadly. Again, in combination with a simple fog, they can take out some of the biggest creatures out there while staying on the board themselves. So of course we've also got some other 1-mana Death Touch creatures like Fang of Shigeki, Narnam Renegade, and Narwood Dryad. On top of that, Narn Renegade is a 1/2 with Revolt. When it enters the battlefield, it's going to come into play with a +1 counter on if a permanent we control left the battlefield this turn. And then Narnam Dryad is a 1/1, but it's going to get +2/+2 as long as there are 4 or more card types among cards in our graveyard. And then our final 1-drop Death Touch creature is Wasteland Viper, a 1/2 with Death Touch that has Blood Rush, pay a green, discard it, target attacking creature gets +1/+2 and gains Death Touch until end of turn. And speaking of sneaky moves, there's Ambush Viper, which is a 2/1 with Flash and Death Touch, so this one can come out of nowhere. Another 2-drop though is Heir of the Wilds, a 2/2 with Death Touch that has, whenever it attacks, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, it's going to get +1/+1 until end of turn. And of course, keep in mind our commander has exactly 4 power. Next up, we've got Deadly Recluse and Thornwield Archer, each of which have Reach and Death Touch, so it can be really hard to get past them. And speaking of getting past, well, Turntimber Basilisk is a 2/1 with Death Touch that has, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may have target creature block Turntimber Basilisk this turn if able. So this one can take out a lot of creatures throughout the game, forcing some unfavorable blocks for our opponents. Moving on, we've got some really heavy hitters though, starting off with Majestic Myriad. It's a star that's power and toughness are each equal to twice the number of creatures we control. On top of that, at the beginning of each combat, it's going to gain flying until end of turn we control a creature with flying. The same is true for First Strike, Double Strike, Death Touch, Haste, Hexproof, Indestructible, Lifelink, Menace, Reach, Trample, and Vigilance. Again, our commander has Vigilance, Haste, and Death Touch, so this can make this thing quite deadly. And speaking of deadly, there's Hornet Queen, a 2/2 with Flying and Death Touch that has, when it enters battlefield, create 4 1/1 green insect creature tokens with Flying and Death Touch. And finally, there's Stone Tongue Basilisk, which is a 4/5 that has, whenever it deals combination to a creature, destroy that creature at end of combat. So, not Death Touch, but kind of Death Touch. And then Threshold, all creatures able to block Stone Tongue Basilisk do so, and again, you've got Threshold if you've got 7 or more cards in your graveyard. So, when we have Threshold, this can be incredibly deadly, forcing our opponents to block with all their creatures, and we can take out quite a few creatures with this each combat. But speaking of forcing blocks, we can also utilize lure effects like Lure. Lure is an aura that says all creatures able to block enchant a creature do so. And Noble Quarry is essentially a 1/1 unicorn with Bestow that does the exact same thing. It also gives a creature +1/+1, but the luring is what's important. Because say we put either of these on our commander, we are going to be forcing our opponents to block it with all their creatures that can. And then with a simple fog again, we can protect our commander and take out a lot of our opponent's creatures. You know, on top of allowing all of our other creatures to get through on that opponent. So of course, we're also going to be utilizing other effects like Alluring Scent and Roar of Challenge. These are each one-off lure effects, and on top of that, Roar of Challenge says that creature gains indestructible until end of turn if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, which actually can save us from utilizing a fog. Next up, we also have some pump effects that lure as well. Declare Dominance, you look upon the Tarrasque, and Revenge of the Hunted. Declare Dominance says target creature gets +3/+3 until end of turn. All creatures able to block it this turn do so. You look upon the Tarrasque says choose 1, run and hide, prevent all combat damage to be dealt to you and creatures you control this turn. Or gather your courage, target creature gets +5/+5 and gains indestructible until end of turn. All creatures your opponents control able to block that creature this turn do so. So this either can be a one-sided fog for us, or again, a way to pump a creature by a lot and force blocks. Speaking of which, there's Revenge of the Hunted, which has Miracle for just a single green mana, so if it's the first card we draw on the turn, we can actually just cast it for that cost. And it says, until end of turn, target creature gets +6/+6 and gains trample, and all creatures able to block it this turn do so. So this is a massive pump effect that also gives our creature trample, so we can get a ton of damage through with this and force out a lot of blocks and basically take out an opponent's entire army. But of course, these aren't the only ways to pump our creatures. So next up, let's talk about Predatory Rampage, a sorcery that says creatures you control get +3/+3 until end of turn. Each creature your opponents control blocks this turn if able. So this can pump our entire team and force a lot of unfavorable blocks for our opponents to take out a lot of creatures. Next up, Thunderfoot Baloth is a 5/5 with trample that has Lieutenant. As long as you control your commander, Thunderfoot Baloth gets +2/+2, and other creatures you control get +2/+2 and have trample. And trample in combination with Death Touch is fantastic because we just have to assign 1 point of damage to a creature to take it out and send the rest of the damage through. And that can be an absolutely massive amount of damage if we utilize cards like Vitalizing Wind in a Creative Savagery. Vitalizing Wind is an instant that says creatures you control get +7/+7 until end of turn. So this can help our creatures hit incredibly hard out of nowhere. And yeah, it's going to be hard for our opponents to decide how and when to block again with a deck like this. So even our smallest creatures can become incredibly deadly. But we also have a permanent way to pump them with Creative Savagery, which is an instant that says put 4/+1 counters on each creature you control. Or if we decide to cycle it away for 4 green, we can actually just put 4 counters on 1 creature. Regardless, again, even our smallest creatures, those 1/1s, are now 5/5s, and that can make a massive difference. But speaking of a massive difference, now let's talk about the golden pig of this deck, which is the #1 card out of our 99. And the golden pig for this deck is Finn the Fangbearer. Finn is a 1/3 human warrior with Death Touch that has, whenever a creature you control with Death Touch deals combo damage to a player, that player gets 2 poison counters. And of course, a player with 10 or more poison counters loses the game. So this is kind of like a pseudo way to give infect to our creatures, and yeah, this can be incredibly deadly, especially with a deck like this. We basically let they get through on 1 player with 5 Death Touch creatures, and they are gone. And of course, that can be quite easy again with all of our lure effects to force an opponent to block a specific creature, then our other ones can just get through. So yeah, Finn can completely turn a game on its head and wipe out opponents in absolutely no time, and that's why it's the golden pig. But of course, now that we've talked about our plan and how to finish off our opponents, let's talk about ways to throw a wrench into our opponent's plans. First up, how about Acidic Slime, a 2/2 with Death Touch itself that has, when it enters the battlefield, destroy target artifact, enchantment, or land. And then Cap Attack Wrecker is a 1/3 with Ninjutsu for 1 and a green that has, it enters the battlefield with a Death Touch counter on it, and whenever it deals combo damage to a player, you may remove a Death Touch counter from it. When you do, exile target artifact or enchantment that player controls. So this can either be a great low to the ground Death Touch creature that we can, Ninjutsu in, or one that we can actually utilize to take out an artifact or enchantment. Speaking of which, we've got some other creatures that can help us out, like Reclamation Sage. It's a 2/1 that has an ETB that's going to destroy target artifact or enchantment. And then Mass Vandal is a 1/3 that has, when it enters the battlefield, you may exile a creature card from your graveyard. If you do, exile target artifact or enchantment an opponent controls. Next up, Return Nature is just a solid removal card. It has choose 1 destroy target artifact, destroy target enchantment, or exile target card from a graveyard. So this can come in really handy in a lot of circumstances. But how are we actually going to get to all these awesome cards? Well, we've got plenty of fantastic ways to draw cards in this deck, starting off with Lifecrafter's Bestiary. It's an artifact that says, beginning of your upkeep, scry 1, and whenever you cast a creature spell, you may pay green. If you do, draw a card. Again, we've got a lot of low-to-the-ground creatures in this deck, so this can draw us a lot of cards for very little cost throughout the game. Moving on, Keeper of Fables is a 4/5 that says, whenever 1 or more non-human creatures you control deal combo damage to a player, draw a card. The vast majority of creatures in this deck are not human, so this can draw us a ton of cards throughout the game. Vivian Stampede says, each creature you control gains Vigilance, Trample, and Melee until end of turn. At the beginning of the next main phase of this turn, draw a card for each player who was dealt combat damage this turn. So this can pump our creatures a good amount, help them swing freely again with that Vigilance, and yeah, also get some damage with that Trample, and on top of that, draw some cards. Moving on, we've got some Death Touch creatures that can help us with some more card advantages, both Occam Adversary, Orin Viper, and Skullwinder. Occam Adversary is going to cost 2 less to cast if an opponent controls a green permanent, which is pretty likely in a game of Commander. It's a 2/3 Death Touch that has, when it deals combo damage to a player, draw a card. Next up, Orin Viper is a 1/3 snake that has, when it deals combo damage to a creature, destroy that creature at end of combat, and whenever it deals combo damage to a player, you may draw a card. And then Skullwinder is a 1/3 Death Touch that has an ETB that says, when it enters the battlefield, return target card from your graveyard to your hand, then choose an opponent, that player returns a card from their graveyard to their hand. So this will help out an opponent, but we can usually politic to get some kind of advantage out of this as well. Next up, we've got some enchantments that can help us out too, like Overwhelming Instinct and Colossal Majesty. Overwhelming Instinct says, whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, draw a card, and Colossal Majesty says, at the beginning of your upkeep, you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. And of course, keep in mind with this deck we're going to be pretty aggressive, and of course our commander does have 4 power. And finally, we can also draw cards with cards like Harmonize and Shamanic Revelation. Harmonize will draw us 3 cards, and Shamanic Revelation is going to draw us a card for each creature we control, and on top of that we gain 4 life for each creature we control at power 4 or greater. But now that we've gone through every single non-land card in this deck, let's talk about the price. Again, like I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, every single card in this deck outside of the commander is less than $1. So even though our commander is nearly $8, the estimated cost for this deck is just $32.07. And of course, keep in mind that this cost does include the cost of basic lands at 10 cents a piece, so you might be able to save even more if you've already got those lands. And you might be able to save even more than that by buying this deck on TCG Player and utilizing heavily played and damaged cards, because of course those cards need a home too. Though do keep in mind that this estimated cost does not include the cost of shipping, which might vary depending upon where you live. And with that, this show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. We also have a ton of brand new t-shirt designs in stock, so make sure you check out those as well. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG Player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support.